I think it's important when we talk about digestive health that we must address the microbiome and the health of our gut, specifically the bacterial diversity in our gut. There is such a greater understanding in recent years about the impact that this microbiome, the collective genomes of the microbes that live in our body, so the genetics of the bacteria, the fungi, the protozoa, the viruses that live inside and on the human body, the impact that those have on our health. We really continue to grow in our understanding of the importance of that is to improve health. And we know now that the increased diversity, so a lot of different species of bacteria in the body, is associated with optimal health. And our diet can certainly have an impact on that and a lot of our lifestyle choices as well. So we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. The dysbiosis can be happening is where we get an altered microbial community. So we have lots of different bacteria and again fungi and viruses and all living in our body, and they can have a symbiotic relationship. So they are meant to be there. They're living happily in and on the human body, but there can be an alteration that happens in that balance in that microbial community, and that can lead to some problems. So it's not necessarily an infection or a disease, but it can lead to and contribute to dysfunction and ultimately potentially disease that can happen in the future. Consider that there is a spectrum of this balance, a spectrum of growth, whether it becomes a situation of overgrowth of negative bacteria, pathogenic bacteria, for example, and we are all sort of living on this spectrum. And where it may cross a line and lead to some problems for people is where we can start to notice how we can have a bigger impact. But we can also consider, what do we do with so many things that we think about nutrition, is how do we promote good health? How do we prevent disease from happening in the future? And addressing the health of the gut bacteria and preventing this dysbiosis early on, before we lead to symptoms, is something that I think we should definitely consider when we're talking about nutrition. I want to mention leaky gut. Another way to say that is intestinal permeability. Maybe that's something that you've heard before. And the idea is that there's a barrier where the absorption of nutrients is regulated across the lining of the intestinal wall. So what should get across is micronutrients, amino acids, fatty acids, and glucose, vitamins and minerals, electrolytes, water. That should be able to flow through the lining of the small intestine. So you'll see in this picture the healthy tight junctions. So the very close proximity of these cells next to each other. This allows enough space for these very microscopic molecules to get through from the absorption in the intestine out into the bloodstream where these nutrients can serve their purpose. But what can happen is that we end up with this faulty tight junction. So now we have this opening, and larger molecules are able to get through out into the bloodstream, and that can cause an immune response, start to cause an inflammatory reaction, which can lead to poor health, can lead to symptoms that people are experiencing. We're continuing to understand the impact that this has on an individual's health. This dysbiosis can be created by a number of different factors. So let's just address these briefly. The pictures I have here, I think, is a really good image to compare the difference. The sieve on the bottom, it has very small openings. That should be the way it is in that barrier of the small intestine. They have very small openings. Small molecules can get through there. But when we get this intestinal permeability, so there's some damage that's happened to that intestinal lining, and now we have more of the strainer on the top, where we have these large holes that larger molecules can get through and again cause that immune response and cause some damage. So why do we shift from this sieve picture to this strainer picture? What happens in our environment, in our food choices, that can potentially be leading us down this path? What we believe to be the case is that stress can have an impact, both physical stressors as well as emotional stressors. Toxins in the environment. We are exposed to hundreds to thousands of chemicals in our air, in our food, in our homes, in products that we live with every day. So potentially some of that exposure to toxins in the environment could be creating this situation. There could be a genetic component to it as well. With all disease conditions, their risk and likelihood of leading down a path of disease and dysfunction can be impacted certainly by their genetics, though that is not destiny. Genetics are not destiny. Doesn't mean necessarily that's going to happen. We still have to have these other lifestyle factors that might be coming in to create the problem to get that started. Also, just to mention in the chemical area, the EPA inventory, this is a statistic from even a few years back, shows that there's 84,000 chemical substances in commerce in the United States. So tremendous amount of chemicals that are in our environment. And nutrition then. So a lot of different possibilities of how nutrition may be impacting this, creating this situation of intestinal permeability. SAD is our abbreviation for the standard American diet. So just sort of the typical American diet, a lot of processed foods, and the list here contains some of those. Inflammatory kinds of fats, processed foods, artificial ingredients, many of those things as components of the standard American diet, we believe that is creating some of this dysbiosis. Also, again, chemical exposure in our food. Some reactivity that people might be having. Corn, dairy, gluten are some of the big ones that we see most commonly. Again, may vary for each individual. That doesn't mean that those things are necessarily bad for everyone, but for some people that could be creating some response, a negative response that's opening up these barriers. Antibiotic exposure in our food-drug interactions. So a lot of people are taking a lot of different medications and how that may impact nutrient needs. And then nutrient depletion could be just a low nutrient diet. Again, that drug interaction could be impacting that, but it could just be poor quality and not having adequate nutrients to keep healthy lining of that intestinal barrier. There's a lot of factors that may go into it. It is probably not just one factor that's creating it, but we really need to consider in nutrition today how the health of our gut is having a really big impact on the health of all of the organ systems and potentially the likelihood of increased disease risk.